Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Power is a prison. For most, the throne is the ultimate prize, a symbol of divine right and absolute authority. But for one man, it was a curse. This is the story of Sultan Murad II, the warrior who craved peace, the conqueror who yearned for solitude, the father who laid down the world's most powerful crown not once, but twice. He fled the palace only to be dragged back by war and betrayal. This is the incredible saga of the sultan who did not want to rule. The year is 1421. The Ottoman Empire holds a collective, fragile breath. For over a decade, it had been a fractured land, torn asunder by the sons of Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt in a brutal civil war known as the Interregnum. It was a time of fratricide, of shifting allegiances, a dark age that nearly erased the Ottoman name from history. From that crucible of chaos, one man emerged victorious: Mehmed I. He was the restorer, the second founder, the man who painstakingly stitched the empire back together. His reign was one of healing, of diplomacy, of binding the wounds of a generation of war. And then, after only 8 years of this hard-won peace, he was gone, felled by a stroke while riding. Into this void steps his son, an 18-year-old named Murad. He was not raised in the crucible of civil war like his father. He was a prince of the Restoration, a symbol of a new, more stable era. But stability was an illusion. The throne he inherited was not a seat of absolute power, but a precarious perch atop a volcano of dormant rivalries and bitter memories. The lords and pashas who watched his coronation were men hardened by the interregnum. They had chosen sides, betrayed brothers, and witnessed the fragility of power firsthand. They now looked upon this untested youth and wondered if the chaos would return. Murad was intelligent, pious, and a capable administrator, but he possessed a quality rarely found in the annals of Ottoman heirs: a profound introspection, a spirit that seemed to yearn more for the tranquility of a Sufi lodge than the bloody intrigues of the Topkapi palace. He was now the guardian of his father's delicate peace, a burden placed upon shoulders that perhaps never sought it. He was the accidental sultan, the inheritor of a legacy of blood and fire, destined to rule an empire whose very foundations were cemented with the bones of his own family. Murad's reign had barely begun when the ghosts of the interregnum rose from their shallow graves. The most formidable of these spectres was a man claiming to be his uncle, Mustafa Çelebi, a long-lost son of Sultan Bayezid. This Düzmece Mustafa, or Mustafa the Impostor as Ottoman loyalists called him, had been a pawn of foreign powers for years. He had fought Murad's father and failed, but with Mehmed's death, he saw his moment. Supported by the aging but cunning Byzantine emperor, Manuel II Palaiologos, Mustafa crossed the Dardanelles into the European heartland of the empire. He was no mere pretender. He was a seasoned warrior and a charismatic leader. The veteran soldiers of Rumelia, many of whom had fought for his supposed father Bayezid, flocked to his banner. He was a living embodiment of the chaotic past, a direct challenge to the fragile legitimacy of Murad's rule. For the young sultan, this was not just a political crisis, it was a deeply personal one. He was forced to wage war against his own blood, or at least a man who credibly claimed to be. The campaign was a brutal lesson in the realities of power. Mustafa captured the great city of Edirne, minted coins in his own name, and acted every bit the sultan. Murad had to rally the Anatolian armies, the loyal core of his father's power, and confront the ghost that haunted his throne. The final confrontation was not a glorious battle, but a story of betrayal. Mustafa's key commanders, persuaded by Murad's agents, abandoned him. He was hunted, captured, and brought before his nephew. There was no room for mercy in this new, brutal world. To secure the peace his father had built, Murad had to extinguish the past. Mustafa was publicly hanged from the walls of Edirne, a stark, grim message that the age of civil war was over, even if it meant spilling family blood to prove it. The execution of one ghost did not grant Murad peace. The Byzantine emperor, Manuel II, had played a dangerous game by supporting Mustafa Çelebi, and it had failed. But the emperor was not without other pawns. He held Murad's two younger brothers, Yusuf and Mahmud, as guests in Constantinople, a polite term for hostages. Seeing the young sultan's resolve, Manuel unleashed his next weapon. Murad's youngest surviving brother, a 13-year-old boy also named Mustafa. Known to history as Küçük Mustafa, or Mustafa the Little, he was a child thrust into the heart of a deadly political storm. The Byzantines presented him with an army and a claim to the Anatolian half of the empire. For Murad, this was a crueler blow than the first. His uncle had been a ghost from a past generation, a man he had never known. This was his own brother, a boy he had likely grown up with in the palace. The betrayal was intimate, sharpened by the cynical manipulation of an external enemy. Küçük Mustafa, guided by his advisors, laid siege to the city of Bursa, the old Ottoman capital. The rebellion was a serious threat, splitting Murad's forces and forcing him to once again turn his armies against his own family. Murad had to abandon a crucial siege of Constantinople to deal with this fire in his own house. The campaign was swift and tragic. Murad's loyal general, Mihalolu Mehmed Bey, tracked the young prince and his forces down near Iznik. In the ensuing battle, the boy prince's army was shattered. Küçük Mustafa was captured, and following the grim law of the dynasty, the law of fratricide designed to prevent another interregnum, he was summarily strangled. Murad had now, within 2 years of taking the throne, been responsible for the deaths of his uncle and his little brother. The throne was secure, but at an unbearable psychological cost. He was a ruler who had to destroy his own family to save his empire, a profound and scarring paradox that would haunt his soul and fuel his growing desire for an escape from the crown. The blood of his brother was fresh on his hands, but Murad's grief was forged into cold fury. The source of his pain, the architect of his family's destruction, was clear: the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. For decades, the city had been a thorn in the Ottoman side, a nest of intrigue that preyed upon their internal divisions, sheltering pretenders and fanning the flames of civil war. Manuel II Palaiologos had unleashed 2 rebellions against him in as many years. Murad decided the time for containment was over. The city itself had to be broken. In the summer of 1422, he marshaled an immense army, a force of vengeance, and marched on the capital of the dying Roman Empire. For the first time in over half a century, a major full-scale Ottoman siege was laid to Constantinople. Murad brought with him the latest in siege technology, including new powerful cannons, a terrifying prelude to what his own son would accomplish 3 decades later. The Ottoman army descended upon the legendary Theodosian walls, the triple line of fortifications that had protected the city for 1,000 years. For 2 months, the air was thick with smoke, the ground shook with cannon fire, and the nights were lit by the flames of war. Murad was relentless, driven by a personal vendetta against the city that had cost him his brother. He even consulted mystics and holy men who prophesied the city's fall on a specific day in August. On that day, he threw everything he had at the walls in a grand assault. But the walls held. The defenders, inspired by visions of the Virgin Mary, fought with desperate courage. And just as the siege reached its crescendo, news arrived that shattered Murad's focus. Another rebellion, stirred by the same Byzantine intrigue, had erupted in Anatolia. He was forced to lift the siege, to turn back from the prize, his vengeance incomplete. The walls had defeated him. The experience was a bitter lesson. He could kill his relatives and besiege the greatest city on earth, but the throne offered no respite. It was a cycle of violence, betrayal, and war without end. The failed siege of Constantinople was not just a military defeat. It was a profound psychological blow that confirmed to Murad that the crown was not a prize, but a curse. For Murad, the Balkans were not a prize to be won, but a wound that would not close. This was no simple frontier. It was a labyrinth of ancient kingdoms, treacherous mountains, and simmering resentments. Every victory was fleeting, every treaty a prelude to the next betrayal. To the west, the despotate of Serbia, under the wily George Branković, played a dangerous game, balancing allegiance to the Sultan with secret overtures to Christian powers. To the north, Wallachia was a land of shadows and sudden violence, its voivodes masters of ambush and scorched earth tactics. And always, like a ghost at the feast, was the dying ember of Byzantium in Constantinople, a constant source of intrigue and a rallying point for any crusade against the Ottomans. The campaigns were brutal and unceasing. Sieges dragged on for months, turning fertile fields into desolate mud pits. Ottoman armies, built for decisive battles on open plains, found themselves bogged down in guerrilla warfare, harassed by local partisans who knew every pass and ravine. The cost in blood and treasure was immense. For every fortress taken, another rebellion flared up elsewhere. The Janissaries, the elite heart of his army, grew restless with the endless, inconclusive fighting. This was not the glorious jihad of his ancestors. It was a grim, attritional struggle that gnawed at the empire's resources and the Sultan's spirit. Murad, a man who preferred philosophy and poetry to the battlefield, found himself trapped in a cycle of punishment and pacification. He was a sovereign chained to a perpetually bleeding frontier, a ruler whose every attempt to bring order only seemed to sow more chaos. The Balkans were a quagmire, and with every passing year, the Sultan could feel it pulling him under, draining his will, his energy, and his hope for a lasting peace. Out of the chaos of the Balkan frontier, a new and terrifying figure emerged. He was not a king or an emperor, but he commanded more fear and respect than either. His name was John Hunyadi, the voivode of Transylvania, a man who would become the nemesis of Murad's reign. To the beleaguered Christians of Europe, he was a savior, the White Knight of Hungary. To the Ottomans, he was the Turski Zmaj, the Turkish dragon, a force of nature who seemed to defy the very laws of war. Hunyadi was unlike any opponent the Ottomans had faced before. He had studied their tactics, learned their strengths, and mastered their weaknesses. He combined the heavy cavalry charge of the Western Knights with the mobile, flexible tactics of the Hussite rebels, creating a hybrid army that was both resilient and deadly. For decades, the Ottoman military machine had been seen as invincible on the field. Hunyadi shattered that illusion. In 1441 and 1442, he inflicted a series of shocking defeats on Murad's regional armies, annihilating them in Transylvania and Wallachia. The news sent tremors through the Ottoman court. These were not mere border skirmishes, they were catastrophic losses. Hunyadi's victories emboldened the Pope and the Kingdom of Hungary to launch a full-scale crusade, the Crusade of Varna. An enormous Christian army, led by Hunyadi and the young King Władysław III of Poland, began to march south, intent on driving the Ottomans from Europe entirely. For Murad, this was the ultimate nightmare. The Balkan quagmire had given birth to a monster, an adversary who not only matched the Ottomans in military skill, but also possessed the strategic vision and personal charisma to unite their enemies against them. John Hunyadi was more than a general. He was an idea, a symbol of defiance that threatened to undo a century of Ottoman conquest. While the frontiers burned, Murad's heart was consumed by a different kind of fire, the future of his dynasty. In the gilded cage of the palace, the greatest anxieties of a sultan were not foreign armies, but his own blood. Murad had several sons, but his hopes, his love, and his plans for a peaceful future rested on one, Shehzadeh Alaeddin Ali. Alaeddin was everything a father and a sultan could desire in an heir. He was intelligent, charismatic, and a skilled warrior, already appointed governor of Amasya, a traditional training ground for future rulers. In him, Murad saw a continuation of his own best qualities, a son who understood the burdens of the crown and possessed the strength to bear them. He poured his affection and his teachings into the young prince, grooming him not merely to rule, but to rule wisely and justly. A peaceful succession was Murad's most fervent personal prayer. He had seen the chaos that followed the death of his own father, the civil wars that had nearly torn the empire apart. He was determined that his own passing would not unleash the same demons. But the Ottoman court was a place of whispers and shadows. Every prince was a potential rival. While Alaeddin was the beloved heir, another son, the young Mehmed, watched from the sidelines. Mehmed was a different creature entirely, intense, fiercely intelligent, and burning with an ambition that even at his young age was unnerving. He was the son Murad respected, perhaps even feared, for his raw, untamed drive. But it was Alaeddin he loved, Alaeddin in whom he placed his trust for the empire's soul. The father in Murad wished for nothing more than to see his favoured son ascend the throne without bloodshed, to secure a legacy of stability. The Sultan in him, however, knew that in the Ottoman world, a father's love was often a prelude to a dynasty's tragedy. In 1443, as John Hunyadi's crusade prepared to strike at the heart of his empire, the world Murad had so carefully constructed was shattered by a single, devastating blow. It did not come from a Hungarian sword or a Serbian betrayal, but from within the walls of his own palace. Shehzadeh Alaeddin Ali, the beloved heir, the repository of all his father's hopes, was dead. The circumstances of his death are shrouded in the deliberate ambiguity of Ottoman chronicles. Some whisper of a riding accident, others of a sudden illness. But the darkest rumours, the ones that festered in the silence of the court, spoke of a more sinister end, strangled by an ambitious rival or a paranoid vizier. For the Ottoman dynasty, fratricide was a grim tool of statecraft, but for Murad, this was no political calculation. This was the death of his soul. The news broke him. The weight of the crown, the endless wars, the constant betrayals. He had borne it all for the sake of his son, for the promise of a stable future. Now, that future was a corpse. The Sultan, the Ghazi warrior, the conqueror of Thessaloniki, was reduced to a grieving father. The empire he had fought so hard to protect suddenly seemed like a meaningless, blood-soaked prison. What was the point of conquest if his legacy was ash? What was the purpose of power if it could not protect the one person he loved most? A profound weariness, a spiritual exhaustion settled over him. The endless Balkan campaign now felt like a fool's errand. The threat of Hunyadi seemed distant, unimportant compared to the vast empty void left by Alaeddin's death. A crack had appeared in the Sultan's soul, and through it, all his desire to rule, all his ambition, drained away. He had lost his heir, and in doing so, he had lost himself. All he wanted was an escape, an end to the crushing burden of a throne that now felt more like a tomb. The year is 1444. A strange quiet has fallen over the Ottoman realm. For the first time in a generation, the drums of war are silent. Sultan Murad II, the warrior who had spent his entire life on the battlefield, has finally secured what he craved most: peace. The Treaty of Szeged, a 10-year truce with the Kingdom of Hungary, was his masterpiece of diplomacy, a guarantee of stability for an empire weary of endless conflict. But for Murad, this political victory was hollow, overshadowed by a personal tragedy that had shattered his world. His beloved son and heir, Alaeddin Ali, was dead, killed in a hunting accident, his future extinguished in a moment of cruel fate. The Sultan, a man who had faced down armies and stared into the abyss of war, was now just a grieving father. The throne, once the symbol of his power, now felt like a gilded cage of sorrow. The endless petitions, the courtly intrigues, the burdens of state, they were now meaningless. He saw the ghost of his lost son in every corner of the palace. And so, in an act that stunned the empire and sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe, Murad II decided to do the unthinkable. He would give it all away. He summoned his Grand Vizier, Sandallah Halil Pasha, and the dignitaries of the court. Before them stood his only surviving son, a boy of 12 named Mehmed. He was a child with a man's ambition burning in his eyes, but a child nonetheless. Murad removed the imperial turban from his own head and placed it upon his sons. He was renouncing the sword, the scepter, and the world. He declared his intention to retire to the quiet hills of Manisa, to seek solace not in power, but in philosophy and contemplation. The court was aghast. To place the fate of a vast, formidable empire into the hands of a boy. It was madness. But Murad's will was iron. He believed the treaty would hold. He believed the viziers could guide his son. He was wrong. As he turned his back on the throne, he was not just leaving a crown for a child, he was leaving a vacuum, and the vultures of Christendom were already beginning to circle. While the court at Edirne seethed with uncertainty, Murad found his sanctuary. The city of Manisa, nestled in the fertile plains of Anatolia, became his haven. Here, the clang of steel was replaced by the gentle strum of the oud, the war councils replaced by circles of intense intellectual debate. The former sultan shed his identity as a conqueror and embraced the life of a scholar and mystic. His villa was not a palace, but an academy, its halls filled with the greatest minds of the age. He surrounded himself with Sufi sheikhs, whose teachings on divine love and detachment from worldly affairs resonated deep within his grieving soul. He spent his days in long discussions with poets, calligraphers, and historians, becoming a patron of a cultural renaissance far from the political heart of the empire. This was not the idle retirement of a tired old man. It was an active, passionate pursuit of meaning. He was attempting to build a fortress of the mind, a spiritual redoubt against the memories of bloodshed and loss that haunted him. He sought to understand the nature of God, the meaning of fate, and the purpose of a life no longer defined by imperial duty. For a brief, fleeting moment, he succeeded. He found a measure of peace in the rhythm of prayer, in the beauty of a perfectly penned verse, in the profound quiet of contemplation. But the world does not stop for one man's search for enlightenment. The peace he had found was an illusion, a fragile bubble sustained only by the treaty he had signed. Every messenger arriving from the capital brought whispers of trouble, of a restless army, a divided court, and a boy sultan struggling to command respect. Murad, the philosopher of Manisa, had successfully retired from the throne, but he could not retire from his destiny. The quiet gardens where he walked and debated were on borrowed time, and the echoes of war were already beginning to drift across the Aegean, threatening to shatter his hard-won tranquility. Back in the capital of Edirne, the power vacuum Murad had left was pulling the empire apart. On the throne sat 12-year-old Mehmed, a prodigy of intellect and ambition, but dangerously arrogant and utterly devoid of experience. He was a hawk in a nest of vipers. The court immediately fractured into warring factions. On one side stood the powerful Grand Vizier, Sandarlı Halil Pasha, a cautious statesman from the old Turkish aristocracy who advocated for stability and diplomacy. On the other were men like Zaganos Pasha, Mehmed's tutor, who whispered dreams of conquest and glory into the boy's ear, feeding his ego and urging him to cast off the old guard. The first to sense the weakness were the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Sultan. They saw a child ruler, a divided court, and an opportunity. They marched on the palace, not with loyalty, but with demands. When their inflated requests for payment were initially refused, they rioted, setting the capital's marketplace ablaze. The sky over Edirne glowed red with the fires of their insubordination. Young Mehmed, faced with his first true crisis, faltered. He capitulated to their demands, a show of weakness that would not be forgotten. He had paid the wolves, but it only made them hungrier. While the empire's heart was consumed by infighting and rebellion, the vultures on its borders took notice. Envoys from Venice, Hungary, and the papacy sent back reports of the chaos: a boy playing sultan, an army in revolt, a government at war with itself. The 10-year peace treaty, sworn on the Bible and the Quran, suddenly seemed like a foolish obstacle. The Christian kings, who had grudgingly accepted the truce when facing the formidable Murad II, now saw a chance they had only dreamed of. The Ottoman Empire was exposed, its legendary strength compromised from within. The child on the throne was not a deterrent. He was an invitation for invasion. The news of Ottoman vulnerability reached Rome, where Pope Eugene IV saw a divine opportunity. The architect of the Christian response was the papal legate, Cardinal Giuliano Cesarini, a man of fiery faith and ruthless political cunning. He travelled to the Hungarian court with a seductive and terrible argument for King Władysław. The Peace of Szeged, he preached, was an unholy pact. An oath sworn to an infidel, he declared, held no power in the eyes of God. To break the treaty was not a sin, it was a sacred duty. His words were the spark that lit the bonfire of a new crusade. The promise of peace was renounced, cast aside for the promise of holy war. A formidable Christian coalition began to assemble. The Kingdom of Hungary and Poland, united under King Władysław, formed the core of the army. They were joined by the fearsome Wallachian cavalry under Vlad Dracul, crusading knights from across Europe, and a powerful Venetian fleet tasked with blockading the Dardanelles Strait, trapping the bulk of the Ottoman army in Anatolia. This was not a border raid, it was a war of annihilation. The goal was nothing less than the complete expulsion of the Turks from Europe. In Edirne, the news was received with sheer panic. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha understood the gravity of the situation completely. The Crusader army was a veteran force led by the brilliant Hungarian general John Hunyadi. The Ottoman forces in the Balkans were outnumbered, and with the Venetian navy controlling the sea, reinforcements were impossible. The boy Sultan Mehmed, full of bravado, insisted he could lead the army himself, but the viziers knew this would be suicide. The empire was caught in a pincer, its European territories about to be overrun, its capital defenseless. As the massive Crusader army marched south, burning villages and putting the populace to the sword, Halil Pasha made a desperate final gamble. He sent the fastest horseman he could find, carrying a single, urgent message. It was addressed to a quiet villa in Manisa, to the philosopher who had renounced the world. The message was simple. Your people face annihilation. Your son cannot save them. Only you can. In the tranquil city of Manisa, far from the intrigues of the capital, Murad sought a different kind of kingdom. Here, among Sufi mystics and contemplative scholars, the man who had commanded vast armies now sought to command only his own soul. The imperial turban was replaced by a simple dervish's cap, the throne by a prayer mat. He had willingly surrendered the temporal world for a spiritual one, leaving the Ottoman Empire in the hands of his 12-year-old son, Mehmed. He believed the state was secure, the treaties were signed, and his life's work was done. He was wrong. Peace, for a man like Murad, was a fragile illusion. A messenger arrived, his horse lathered in sweat, carrying a dispatch that would shatter the Sultan's serene retirement. The letter was from Edirne, a cry of desperation from the heart of the empire he had abandoned. The great Christian powers of Europe, seeing a child on the throne, had smelled weakness. Pope Eugene IV had declared their peace treaty null and void, and a massive Crusader army was marching on Ottoman lands. The letter, penned by the Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, but sealed with the authority of his son, was a desperate summons. The boy Sultan, surrounded by panicked ministers, was unequal to the storm. The words, as history has famously recorded them, were a masterful stroke of psychological leverage, a challenge a father and a ruler could not ignore. If you are the Sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the Sultan, I command you to come and lead my armies. The dilemma was absolute. It was a checkmate of duty. In that moment, Murad's spiritual retreat was over. The quiet gardens of Manisa faded away, replaced by the grim shadow of the battlefield. The dervish had to become a warrior once more, not for glory or conquest, but because the world would not let him rest. Murad returned not as a sultan reclaiming his throne, but as a father answering a call to war. He left young Mehmed as the nominal ruler in Edirne, taking for himself only the title of commander. His march north was a grim procession, a journey back into a life he desperately wished to leave behind. On the other side, The Crusader army, a formidable coalition of Hungarian, Polish, Wallachian, and Papal forces, advanced with righteous certainty. Their leader, the young King Władysław of Poland and Hungary, was buoyed by the blessings of the papal legate, Cardinal Cesarini, who had assured him that an oath made to an infidel was no oath at all. The Treaty of Szeged, a solemn pact promising 10 years of peace, was now nothing but discarded parchment. As the two armies faced each other near the Black Sea port of Varna in November 1444, the Ottomans were outnumbered. But they had Murad. In a moment of supreme psychological warfare, Murad ordered the broken treaty to be impaled upon a spear and raised high for all to see, a silent, damning accusation against the Christian king. The battle was a maelstrom of chaos and steel. The Crusader knights crashed against the Ottoman lines, their heavy cavalry initially seeming invincible. But Murad's experience held the line. He anchored his army with the unshakable Janissaries. The turning point came with an act of fatal hubris. King Władysław, seeing an opportunity, led a reckless, desperate charge directly at Murad's personal guard. It was a gamble for ultimate glory, and it failed catastrophically. The king was unhorsed, surrounded, and slain. His head was severed and placed upon another spear, a gruesome counterpoint to the broken treaty. The sight shattered the Crusader morale. An army that had marched under the banner of faith now fled in godless terror. Murad stood victorious, a reluctant conqueror on a field he never wanted to see. The threat was annihilated. The head of the perjuring king was a stark warning to Christendom. The empire was safe. For Murad, the task was complete. His duty was discharged. He had answered the call, led the armies, and secured his son's throne. Now, all he desired was to return to the quiet solitude of Manisa, to his books, his faith, and his peace. He turned his back on the court and travelled back to his chosen life, once again leaving the administration to his son Mehmed and the powerful Grand Vizier, Tsandala Halil Pasha. But the victory at Varna had an unintended consequence. It had not proven Mehmed's strength. It had only highlighted his dependence on his father. In Edirne, the court was a viper's nest of factionalism. The young sultan, intelligent but arrogant and impetuous, clashed constantly with the old guard, particularly Halil Pasha. The Grand Vizier, who had dedicated his life to the stability of the Ottoman state, saw in Mehmed a dangerous recklessness. He had witnessed the boy's panic before Varna, and now saw his rash decisions in its aftermath. He feared that this precocious child would undo everything Murad had built. Halil Pasha and the other senior viziers made a calculated, fateful decision. The empire needed more than a placeholder. It needed a true sultan. They began a quiet but relentless campaign of pressure. Messengers were sent to Manisa, not with requests for military aid, but with pleas for governance. They argued that the state was adrift, that the Janissaries were restless, that only Murad's steady hand could ensure order. This was not a glorious restoration. It was a political coup born of necessity. Murad resisted, but the weight of the entire state apparatus was against him. He was trapped by his own competence. Finally, he relented. He returned to Edirne in 1446, not to advise, but to rule. Mehmed was quietly deposed and sent to Manisa as governor, a bitter, humiliating reversal for the ambitious prince. Murad II was sultan once more, a prisoner on the throne he had twice tried to escape. Murad's second ascension was not met with universal acclaim. While the viziers breathed a sigh of relief, a dangerous current of resentment flowed through the capital. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Sultan, were the empire's double-edged sword, fiercely loyal on the battlefield, but volatile and entitled in the palace. They had fought and bled for Murad at Varna, but their loyalties in the court were complex and easily bought. Factions loyal to the deposed Mehmed saw an opportunity in their discontent. Whispers spread through their barracks in Edirne, whispers of disrespect, of a sultan who had abandoned them once and could do so again. In 1446, the whispers erupted into open revolt. It began as a protest over debased coinage, but quickly escalated into a direct challenge to Murad's authority. The Janissaries poured into the streets, setting fires, looting the market, and creating a state of anarchy in the imperial capital. For the victor of Varna, the conqueror of crusaders, it was a moment of profound humiliation. The very men who formed the bedrock of his military power now held him hostage in his own city. They were not merely demanding money, they were demonstrating that the Sultan ruled only with their consent. Trapped in his palace, Murad was forced to negotiate. He met their demands, paying them a handsome donative and executing the officials they blamed for their grievances. He restored order, but at a terrible price. He had shown weakness, or at least the pragmatism of a ruler who understood where true power lay. The event left deep scars. It solidified in Murad's mind the necessity of his rule, the fragility of the peace he so craved. And for the young Mehmed, watching from his exile in Manisa, it was a formative lesson. He learned of the Janissaries' fickle power and developed a deep-seated hatred for the Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, whom he blamed for his father's return and this subsequent humiliation. The seeds of a future vengeance were sown in the ashes of the Edirne markets. The peace Murad craved was a fragile dream, shattered by the thunder of marching feet. In his tranquil retreat in Manisa, surrounded by scholars and Sufi mystics, the world he had renounced came crashing back. A panicked message arrived from the capital. The treaty was broken. King Ladislaus of Hungary, absolved of his oath by a papal legate, led a massive crusader army across the Danube. They were carving a bloody path through the Balkans, and Edirne itself was threatened. The empire was in peril, ruled by a boy of 12, whose authority crumbled in the face of crisis. The Janissaries, the elite heart of the Ottoman military, were in open revolt, disrespecting the young Sultan Mehmed. The Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, sent a desperate, now legendary, plea to Manisa. It was not a request, it was an ultimatum of duty. If you are the Sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the Sultan, I hereby order you to come and lead my armies. The words were a dagger to Murad's quiet life. The philosopher had to become a warrior once more. The journey from Manisa back to the throne was not a triumphant return, it was a grim acceptance of fate. He crossed the Bosphorus, allegedly paying a ducat per soldier to Genoese captains, who, in a perfect display of wartime opportunism, were also ferrying crusaders across the Danube further north. Murad was no longer the weary man who had abdicated. A different fire burned in his eyes now, one forged in betrayal and necessity. He was the protector of the realm, the shield of Islam. Every step towards the battlefield at Varna was a step away from the man he wanted to be, and a step closer to the conqueror his empire needed. The dervish robes were put away. The mail and steel were brought out. The weight of an empire settled back onto his shoulders, heavier than ever before. 4 years after the disaster at Varna, the ghost of the crusade had not been laid to rest. John Hunyadi, the White Knight of Hungary, was a man obsessed with vengeance. He had spent years rebuilding, forging a new coalition, determined to break Ottoman power in the Balkans forever. In 1448, he marched south again, his destination a place already steeped in legend and bloodshed, Kosovo Polja, the field of blackbirds. For Murad, this was not merely another battle, it was the final reckoning. This was the chance to extinguish the embers of crusader ambition for a generation. He marshalled a vast veteran army, a force hardened by a decade of constant warfare. When the two armies met on that fateful field, the air was thick with history. It was here, nearly 60 years prior, that Murad's own grandfather had conquered and died. Now, the grandson stood ready to cement that legacy in blood and iron. The Second Battle of Kosovo was a brutal, 3-day affair. It was not a battle of brilliant maneuvers, but a savage, grinding contest of will. Hunyadi's European knights charged the Ottoman centre, a wall of steel and faith, only to be met by the unyielding discipline of the Janissaries, firing muskets from behind a barricade of stakes. Ottoman cavalry, the Akinci light horse, and the Sipahi heavy cavalry harried the flanks, turning the battle into a maelstrom of chaos. On the third day, Murad executed his final crushing move. A feigned retreat by his Anatolian horsemen lured the overconfident knights into a trap, and the Ottoman center surged forward, enveloping and annihilating them. The victory was absolute. The Crusader army was shattered, and the dream of a Christian reconquest of the Balkans died with it on the field of blackbirds. Murad had secured his empire's European frontier, not with a treaty, but with the sword. The message to the West was clear and unequivocal. The Ottomans were here to stay. Victory at Kosovo brought security, but it did not bring peace to Murad's soul. He was once again the undisputed master of a vast empire, a victor hailed as a Ghazi, a holy warrior. Yet, the throne felt more like a prison than a prize. The man who had twice sought a life of quiet contemplation was now irrevocably bound by duty and success. His second reign was marked by a profound weariness, the exhaustion of a man living a life he had not chosen. He had seen the fragility of his son's first rule, the chaos that erupted when a firm hand was absent. He knew he could not abdicate again. The empire's stability rested squarely on his shoulders, a burden he accepted with grim resignation. He had to manage the very janissaries who had once rioted against his son. They were loyal to Murad, the victorious commander, but he understood their power was a double-edged sword. He kept them occupied with campaigns against Skanderbeg in Albania and quelling minor revolts, channeling their warrior energy outwards, away from the capital. But this constant state of warfare was a drain on his spirit. In the quiet moments in his palace at Edirne, he turned to what gave him solace: patronage of the arts, poetry, and architecture. He commissioned magnificent mosques and bridges, fostering a cultural flourishing that stood in stark contrast to his military endeavors. It was as if he were trying to build a legacy of peace to balance his legacy of war. He was a ruler trapped between two identities: the pious Sufi who yearned for God, and the Sultan who had to command armies and order executions. Every decree he signed, every campaign he planned, was a reminder of the life he had lost. The second reign was not a return to glory for Murad. It was the long, final act of a profound personal sacrifice. By the winter of 1451, the Ottoman Empire was calm. The borders were secure, the Crusaders decisively beaten, and the internal machinery of state ran smoothly under the Sultan's experienced hand. At his palace in Edirne, Murad II, now in his late 40s, could finally allow himself a measure of the tranquility he had so desperately sought. The fires of war had been banked, and the constant pressure of imminent crisis had receded. He spent his final years, much as he had always wished, overseeing justice, engaging with scholars, and ensuring the foundations of the empire were strong enough for the son who would inevitably succeed him again. His relationship with Mehmed, the brilliant and ambitious prince, had been complex. He had taken back the throne from the boy, a necessary humiliation to save the state. Now, he carefully prepared him, ensuring the transition of power, when it came, would be seamless. He had forged the sword. It was now up to his son to wield it. In February of 1451, while enjoying a winter's ride, Murad suffered a sudden, catastrophic stroke. He was carried back to his palace, and after a short illness, the Sultan who never truly wanted to rule was dead. His passing was not the violent, tragic end of a warrior on the battlefield, but a quiet release. It was the peaceful end he might have chosen for himself. His last will was a testament to his character. He asked not to be buried in a grand mausoleum, but in a simple, open-topped tomb in Bursa, so that the rain, a symbol of God's mercy, could fall upon his grave. His legacy is one of profound irony. He was a reluctant ruler who became one of the most effective of his era. He sought peace, but waged relentless war. He twice gave up power, only to be forced to reclaim it and lead his empire to its greatest victories yet, paving the direct road for his son, Mehmed, to achieve the ultimate prize, Constantinople. Murad II finally found his peace, leaving behind an empire stronger and more secure than ever before, a monumental legacy for a man whose greatest desire was to be left alone.